an anti-cancer. Turns out it was environmental factors, but it was lived her entire life there, but it wasn't tied to that at all. It was tied to some other goofy, non-environmental.
They started like looking at horses and stuff like that too for like breed purposes.
Genetic.
This is one of the traits that brings up
Yes.
this.
Yes.
So they've like that's one of the cool things I've seen like the last.
Oh, for phenomenal.
8 years, yeah, they've had these huge
Markers.
banks and they've been able to go.
Absolutely, markers. There was a case. Sally Clark. She was a London attorney, and she lost it. This is back in the 90s, I think. She lost a child to SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. They call it crib death. Excuse me, cot death in London. She lost a child, which is awful, and of course, I mean, terrible, terrible, terrible. And the family goes. 2 years later, lost another one to SIDS again.
We studied this.
Did you? Yeah. And the idea was that she was then tried for murder. Her and her husband were tried for murder because they said the chance of a SIDS death in London is 1 in like 8,000. The chance of 2, therefore, is 1 in 8,000 squared, which is 1 in 64 million. Now, based on that, small p-value, right? P-value, small p-value. Here's the curve of innocence.
But maybe there's
Here's the curve of innocence. Here she's innocent. Where did she land? In that tail down there, right? So, if she's off the curve of innocence, she must be not innocent. Never say guilty, I guess they do say guilty. They never say innocent. They say not guilty, guilty. Put in jail. And then, finally, the math community came to her rescue and said, time out. Why did you multiply the 1 in 8,000 times 1 in 8,000? They said, well, they're independent events. And they said, can you prove they're independent events? They said, what do you mean? And they said, well, you haven't proven to me that there isn't some other factor contributing to the kid's death besides the mother killing him. And they dug into London historical records, and as it turns out, in the same time period, the same decade around the time Sally Clark had lost her 2 children, 7 other families lost 2 kids to cot death. And all of a sudden, it goes from a 1 in 64 million probability to a 1 in 8. Because there's a genetic tie. They discovered there's a genetic tie. If you lose a child to cot death, there's a higher probability you will lose another one to the cot death. But I don't understand the science or the medical bit behind it. But all of a sudden, 1 in 64 million becomes 12.5%, which is well above 5%, which puts her back on the not guilty curve. You see what I'm saying? Unfortunately, the damage was done. She ended up dying herself. She developed a drinking problem. I mean, I can't even imagine losing 1 child, let alone 2. But the bad math put her behind bars, and the statisticians finally came to her like, time out, what the hell?
But you just screwed up someone's life because you didn't do your math right.
I mean, it's bad enough she lost 2 children. Now we're going to try her for murder that she didn't commit, and her husband as well. So I mean, that's the idea. You have to be real careful with the data that you gather in, because your conclusions are only as good as the data you bring in. Now that's why there's entire courses devoted to research methods to develop those kinds of ideas. You got to make sure. I was on the phone yesterday with a guy who's an investment guy in town, and he wants to make a prospectus for his clients. And he gave me a bunch of numbers, and I said, "Can you tell me about how these probabilities are interrelated?" Right here, he's like, "I'll just assume they're independent." And I'm like, "Okay. Can you prove to me they're independent?" As it turns out, you can look at probabilistic models to show things are independent or not. If we get to time, we'll do Sally Clark's in that method at the end of class. But he's like, no, assume they're independent. I'm like, okay, that makes my math really easy, but can you prove to me that if small cap goes up, large cap doesn't? And he wasn't getting the point, like, can you separate them out? Does this market operate independently of this market? I know nothing about economics, but I'm pretty sure that markets don't operate independently of each other. But he kept saying, prove it, assume independence. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to put a big old footnote on the bottom of my report for you and say, I was told to assume these are independent. And here's my math. And if you decide later on they're not, we'll redo the math for you. Yeah?
I mean, even assuming that the 2 instances with SIDS was independent, SIDS is sudden infant death syndrome.
Yes.
There is no proof to show she suffocated, drugged. I mean...
Sure, but it was ruled as SIDS. The lawyer said, not SIDS. They basically threw the SIDS away. It was reported as cot death. So basically, the mom comes in, finds that... I don't want to think about that, but... The idea is, no, they didn't throw the science away. They said, oh no, SIDS is an excuse. You murdered your children. What amazes me is the other 7 cases went undetected. Did you know anything about those other 7 cases?
One of them had been in jail too.
Quite possibly. She did mention it to you. Yeah, I got out the original manuscript from the cases. I think it was back in the 90s.
factors?
It's crazy, but it's so easy. It's so easy to multiply probabilities when you should be thinking about whether you should be multiplying. It's the Jurassic Park mathematical defense I've often given. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. I mean, we've learned lots of tools in these classes, and yet we're going back to conditional probabilities. People, you have to. You have to look at it conditionally, because you can't always assume independence. Under certain conditions, absolutely. But only under certain conditions. Go ahead, Harrison.
So when I went to